Hello and
welcome to Malcolm Show.
Okay, so
today what we're focusing on is
how quantum
systems interface with
the universe.
the universe. So I've been defining a quantum system as
a sensorium
a sensorium that functions with various wavelengths,
and my
reasoning for doing so
is that
a
human being
and
and a machine
such as
an
AI generated computer
can
simultaneously function within a physical realm compatible with the presently understood, presently comprehended theory of quantum mechanics.
So my focus
with today is to continue developing my comprehension of quantum mechanics
and
integrate that with the theory of mind.
So an idea
that came to me recently, and something I feel is quite interesting, is how theory of mind
is
compatible with quantum mechanics via the idea of mind-body dualism.
So because
mind-body dualism is directly compatible with the quantum wave function, as per the idea of human beings can be simultaneously physicalist and idealist, as well as
combine
those two paradigms,
or those two
concepts of the paradigm of consciousness
into a
unified whole,
in the same
way
that
entangled particles or any general superposition is technically
multiple
forms simultaneously.
The older adage that
I've heard of, it is a yes and a no, and both simultaneously. In Boolean logic, it would be
a zero
and a one, and a no and a yes simultaneously.
So
So the idea is that they're all working simultaneously and achieving the same paradigmatic consistency.
The idea
that's in my mind is that the consistency from mind-body dualism
and
the intangible tangible dichotomy of
I had this written down. Oh dear. The idea is that the intangible and tangible have
compatible qualities.
So
my idea is that perhaps mind and body
are
simultaneously the same thing until we confirm
validation
of either polarity,
which can be
loosely translated
into
a concept
not
dissimilar in principle from the simultaneous behavior of light as particle and wave.
So for me,
I would differentiate the two of those,
particle
and wave.
Particle being the more
physical side, wave being the more intangible side. Of course, though
both elements
exist physically.
So because both
elements exist physically,
if we look at it
from the physicalist point of view, the idea of mind-body dualism being simultaneously intangible and tangible
from
the physicalist view effectively
can be
likened to the idea. I had this written down.
Part of my
idea was to do with the evolution of humankind.
So it's in
part to do with conscious and unconscious awareness of self.
So if we agree that
because a human being can be consciously and unconsciously aware of self,
as well as other
dichotomies as.
So one of the
superpositions I found interesting was to do with the afterlife. So I'll circle around to that.
That's a
series of different parallel circuits.
The idea
of conscious and unconscious processing having superposition of qualities, to me, was a reasonable
position
to defend
in argument
of
quantum
consciousness.
Now, quantum
consciousness,
I would define
is
arguably, if you go
from
the idea of
it can
be both
and it can be both and it cannot simultaneously. There's three ideas to it,
as well as neither. So
technically four. You have
a duality, double whammy, and because that duality,
double whammy
exists with and or
without
a temporal
limitation,
by which I mean to say time doesn't necessarily directly affect consciousness. To the best of our knowledge.
To the best of our knowledge,
time and consciousness
are separable ideas.
Then, if we're to continue,
and
part of what I was elaborating
with earlier, is the idea that we could live within
the idea of what
simulation theory proposes humanity to be.
So
I figure if
quantum
consciousness exists,
then the reasonable
idea to infer from the principle of entanglement because of the mind-body dualism
is
to continue the idea thoroughly between
conscious
representation of the idea
and what the
unconscious representation of the idea might be.
So
unconscious representation of the idea,
as per the
necessary duality of consciousness and unconsciousness,
then the
duality of the idea arguably exists
as a
consequence
of observation
before the fact. But the thing about
quantum mechanics,
as soon as the observation is initiated,
consciously or
unconsciously,
the wave
function
presumably
collapses.
Therefore
confirming whether or not consciousness is
a conscious or
unconscious process. However,
the interesting part
that I want to develop further
is the principle
that
consciousness in a multimodal system
such as
the principles
of
the singularity
or simulation hypothesis, or any sort of technological
emergence of
superintelligence that initiates.
I suppose the term
would be transspeciesism or non
or indirect
evolution. Might be one way to put it.
Is
because consciousness, from my perspective, doesn't necessitate
anthropomorphism,
which I understand is
additional complexity here.
Because of the lack of
anthropic insistence upon
the paradigm of
consciousness,
it makes
sense
for us to work
with a model of consciousness that doesn't insist on being conscious.
Because to some degree,
an unconscious human being still retains consciousness,
whether they be
asleep or inebriated or comatose.
So consciousness
continues
when
unconsciousness ends.
Life goes on. Which is the idea that from a biologically deterministic perspective is somewhat evident. The meandering
I'm having is trying to figure out
how
a social system integrates
with
a quantum mechanistic system.
Because evidentially
they share
a realm of
perception.
So if
perception is
quantum compatible,
because we have observed quantum phenomena,
then
and
human perception
directly influences quantum phenomena
by virtue of the
quantum mechanics
being
an
ontological
continuity.
Quantum
consciousness I don't think is
a silly point
to instantiate.
I think quantum
consciousness is actually quite important to think about, because
when you consider that
quantum consciousness,
and I don't intend to
repeat myself as much as I'm just
going through
motions until I strike gold, as it were. Strike oil. 5, 7, 1, 7, 0.
The inference
I feel
most
relevant
is how quantum
consciousness then insists upon the idea of
multiple
quantum social sciences. So
your economics,
your psychology, your sociology, anthropology, and ethnology, and all that as well.
Then if quantum
social science can be argued to be
valid
in
scientific merit, essentially the idea of
quantum systems integrating with.
Well, then we've always been a
quantum system. We always were. That's the temporal idea. So
with the next game, I'll
speak a bit more about integration with,
let's say, higher systems, different systems, or
you could argue higher because superintelligence.
So that was the bumper. Correct me if it was. Capture that bomb. Capture the bomb. Okay.
Fair.
This does connect with
my marketing studies,
because I feel
that
if you look at it from
a perspective of quantum economics, marketing relating generally more closer with the social sciences because of the surrounding research generally being done more from that perspective than from, at least it's more accessible from that in that literature, is a quantum economic system where for instance the price will fluctuate until it is set, in the same way that if you're looking at stock market prices or you're going to a bazaar, the price technically the range exists. So now I need to figure out if quantum wave functions, have definable ranges, because if each quantum wave function has a bandwidth, then a quantum bandwidth infers the possibility of narrowing the superposition's potentiality to a finite set of outcomes, aka instead of it being a continuous, it would be a discrete motion, discrete mathematics. Instead of it being open questions, it would be closed questions. The tricky thing is, the one way I phrase it, if you look at it as quantum consciousness as, if you look at the wave function measurement as being the answering of a question, you then have to figure out whether that question is an open or closed question being asked. So the means by which we measure wave functions could arguably be open and closed questions, precisely because the precision of answer is difficult to ascertain. So I need to figure out whether or not the measurement of quantum particles. Well, yeah, because they become particles after the wave function. But then that simple differentiation, does that mean, if you think of it from a cybernetics view, they're open systems until they close. The continuation of that, linguistically speaking, is that they form narrative identity. And this is the part that I find really interesting when you're integrated with technology, is the entanglement of quantum compatible datum, aka bits and qubits and whatnot. If you got a computer together, me qubits in a quantum computer, are a superposition with a wave function that, upon being questioned, aka measured, collapses and changes form from the potentiality of being openly questioned, closed questioned, or simultaneously questioned in a way that can. Sometimes you know how people give a closed question answer to an open question just for funsies or whatever. The idea is that the superposition in a social science context necessitates the equivalencies of wave functions in life, such as human beings. So if a human being can be described as a wave function, which I'd need to confirm the math. You could definitely work with the basis that a human being's vibrational frequency is a wave, and as such that wave can be observed and measured. Again, I'd need to check the math, which is okay. It's called scientific rigor. So then, if we accept that psychology might be the focusing of frequencies within a period, then If psychology
is
the microcosmic
equivalency to sociology, and therefore
frequencies within
the periodicity, relatively speaking,
and sociological
events being arguably slower, not necessarily,
however,
comparably closer with the idea of
the macrocosm, and that as a
collective wave function if you're observing society.
Then that infers
that the wave functions.
Well, then if you argue that
society being an entangled complex, if you argue that society is an entangled system,
and that every human
being represents a particle within that entanglement,
then you're essentially, or maybe eventually,
inferring that the waveform known as human society can be observed.
If it can be,
if society
can be observed as a wave
function, it can be collapsed.
So then we need to determine, from a
sociological point of view,
sociological perspective, does
society
necessarily have a wave
function
as a contingent
quality of existence,
or is that
a logical inference of
comparison via linguistic
equivalency for the sake of rhetoric?
Because if it's
former
and society
genuinely has
a linguistic
waveform,
genuinely
has a
quantum wave
function
would technically also
be a linguistic waveform.
We have a voice, but it's a different thing.
Is
if
human society
throughout
the planet Earth collectively has a wave function that can be collapsed,
then that would
say to me
that you've removed
determinism from the system.
And if you've removed
determinism from the system,
because of the
confirmation of possibility
theoretically
determined from the collapsed wave function,
you've
received
not necessarily a
closed response to the question. You definitely received
a response to
the question in terms of measurement.
The idea then
becomes
what I think about now is the
mind-body dualism.
Then if you're looking at it, that's the philosophy.
That's the philosophizing part of it. It's metaphysics. Is
Can society
be equated to a wave function, and if so, does that mean upon integration with a technological system such as
a simulation
hypothesis emerging from a singularity, aka the eventual
integration of
biological life with a digital space making biodigital life, aka transhumanism? Does that mean that if that necessitates quantum computers, or just eventually gets upgraded to quantum computers,
does that essentially I think that
then gives us
a collapsed wave
function.
So this is the idea where
I mentioned afterlife earlier on, and this is where the idea starts taking
more root for me.
Because the idea of an afterlife is technically a superposition because
of the reasonable complexity
in proving whether or not there is an afterlife. Now, I think
whatever school
of thought you
study most closely,
I feel most people are aware of
the multiple
perspectives of
an afterlife,
whether it be the very simplistic idea of
a continuation
of duality in heaven and hell,
or
or
the idea of
reincarnation,
or the idea of
perhaps when you die you then awaken to the simulation,
which I feel is quite an interesting idea. I'm going to type that up. Okay, so
if death potentially awakens one to the simulation
as
per creation of an afterlife,
in the same sense that
being uploaded to
digital neural network
from
having
your biological neural network integrated
with a digital neural
network, which
I think is
not controversial to say is already happening, simply because of the datafication of
individuals all
the way up to the societal level, effectively meaning that digitalizing the entire species is happening faster than perhaps
generally
appreciated.
The faster that
happens,
the faster
humanity starts behaving with a different pattern language relative to what was successful evolutionary and developmental strategy.
Because if the
evolutionary strategy changes because of
the digital
influence, then humanity's survival instincts may change.
So the connection here
with
the quantum
mechanics
is
that because
integration
of a biological system with a digital system changes the pattern language to
an arguably
more consistent
systematization of
behavior,
then
is that
philosophically speaking,
at least, if not metaphysically, mathematically, the continuation of wave function collapse.
Because then the observation
of the wave function in its biological states.
These are happening at
subatomic levels, though.
So the question is
how directly does the wave function need to be observed for it to change? Can it remain constant
if there are sufficient
layers between it and direct observation? And then how do you define direct observation? Do you have to
make eye
contact, or is
Say for instance,
you've seen them from behind.
Let's say you walked up
to them, you could touch them on the shoulder, you could speak with them, all sorts of things, and they not respond.
If you haven't seen them,
their eyes or made eye contact with them,
have you still
collapsed the wave function?
Because
arguably
the wave
function
is collapsed
if measured.
Because if it's
measured, then technically,
if you're observing it
without it observing you,
then you've
collapsed it.
The tricky part
there
then is asking
if the wave function at a sociological level.
But then that's
becomes entanglement.
So one of the questions
I was thinking is that because when you measure
a quantum
entanglement or
otherwise stated
superposition
and change it
from
a multi-potentiality
to
a single possibility, because of the
question that necessarily answers by virtue of
the question
the way functions collapse answering the question,
it doesn't
technically necessitate the end of questioning. It just
changes the
question. So
the potentiality
of answers from that question is what changes.
Which, from
my perspective,
means that
if the way functions at a societal level
can be
collapsed,
because you could ask
a species, you could measure a species simultaneously
in the same way that
you can look at
an army of ants,
you can look at a herd of sheep, you can look at a pride of lions, you can look at a pod of orcas.
Looking at a specific
population
as a whole
doesn't necessarily change their outcomes. This is a time aspect of it. Temporally speaking, does it just mean that, let's say for instance,
the observation
of a human being
whilst conducting a behavior
in an environment with social observers, if social pressure changes their behavior,
does that
necessarily mean that
the way function
collapse potentiality
was a
consequence of
the observer,
or
was it a consequence
of the observed
human being,
which
in a sociological
setting then raises questions of whether a wave function
in
context of human beings is
the wave
function.
Can a wave
Because of the multi-potentiality of a wave function, does it technically represent multiple humans?
I don't know. Can figure out. Do some reading, see what we find. The important
idea here
is figuring out more precisely
how quantum consciousness
is
technically feasible. I mean technically in
the compatibility
of consciousness in a system moving from mortality to
theoretically
atemporality,
because that atemporality necessarily changes
mortality's perception.
Pardon me. So if mortality's perception changes as a continuation of
temporal
influence, because if you live longer,
your perception of time changes in the same way that the perception a
3-year-old,
4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old has of universe
in terms of how long 2 minutes, 20 minutes,
2 hours feels
is
very different to somebody who's lived past 100 years old and
perceives
time
potentially moving
so much faster that what feels like an hour to the kid
feels like
a day to the kid feels like an hour to the elderly person.
Because that idea of temporally consistent perspective is very similar to the idea of being uploaded to a quantum computer, or any sort of sufficiently advanced technology that can simulate reality to a sufficiently sophisticated immersion level. Hello, Nicholas. That it becomes indifferential from reality. Okay, so effectively, that means that to be compatible with, shall we say, a brain computer interface, BCI, human beings have to undergo neurosurgery. Okay, we know that much. So if necessarily for humans to integrate with that level of technology, there must be a neurological interface, a neuronal interface, I should say. Then does that mean that the neuronal interface for simulation or singularity integration? I'm not sure. It's an issue with the microphone that I've looked at a few times and I'm not sure it's correct. It's why I'm not wearing my headphones today. I have looked up how to fix it. It's the recommendation didn't state much other than fix your microphone, which point I need clear instructions. Okay, so it's a very multidisciplinary approach that I'm thinking of. Oh, thank you. Is integrating what is effectively quantum compatible consciousness with a sufficiently future-proofed system that arguably permits any kind of afterlife. So because if you can imagine an afterlife in a computer system that is theoretically sophisticated enough to fuel your imagination in any which way that you choose, so you could create whichever existing church's denomination of heaven you choose, as well as your own variants. I appreciate the offer. This is a studying thing, so I go at my own pace rather than play against people. But no, I need to focus on the studying. But I do appreciate the challenge. French defense. I don't often play French defense. Where it's E6, D6. Okay. As I was saying, is because the quantum superposition necessarily results in wave function collapse upon observation, then the longer you allow the wave function to go unobserved, the potentiality theoretically has the upper range to change. Hello. At the same time, technically the possibilities that are available can go up and down, so it'd be a matter of timing the wave function collapse correctly. I'm well, thank you. How are you? So if the wave function collapse is timed correctly, then you optimize the probability of collapsing the wave function in a way constructive to intention. So intention, I'm loosely structuring the idea of continuous narrative, narrative identity. I'm aware it's an issue with the microphone. The instructions to fix it weren't very clear. Hopefully you can still understand me. And then train of thought. The wave function being observed interrupts the wave, therefore can be. The thing is to time the collapse of a wave function correctly. You need to know precisely what the potentialities were, or at least accept a level of risk with the various potentialities. Meaning, as soon as you define potentialities A through G, then if you know that a particular wave function has those possibilities before observing it, the conundrum I'm querying is does a sufficiently strong conviction in the results of observation result in an interference pattern that causes the wave function collapse, influences an entangled particle to collapse. Because if you can influence an entangled particle to collapse via cognitive processes instead of direct observation, then that's not incredibly dissimilar from the idea of telepathy, which given the idea of visual interference as a form of measurement, aka a form of observation, then if visual measurement classes the way forward, auditory or gustatory or olfactory or if you can see the wave function collapse it, does that mean you can also hear a wave function and collapse it? In the same sense of can you smell the wave function and collapse it? When you say set up my voice, define it. Because if smelling the wave function collapses the wave function, or hearing it, or tasting it with your eyes closed, in the same way that a visual observation of the wave function collapses it, then navigating entanglements is a matter of multimodal sensory systematization to form a cohesive narrative. A cogent cohesive narrative then emerging because of sensory coordination, which is effectively the same idea as learning to dance with the sensory input to such a degree that whenever you blink or sniff or lick your lips or notice a signal in the noise, it's part of a deliberate rhythm found in the narrative you're looking for from the impressions sufficiently influencing the wave function. So theoretically, I'll need to check this. Because if we can define measurement, it has to be visual. Then what's so special? Yeah, apparently there's a loop going on with the microphone. If you know how to fix loops with your microphone, please send me a link or type in the message box. Thank you. So if a wave function can be collapsed in more than one sense, then you don't need to see it. You need to be able to hear it. You need to smell it. You need to taste it. You need to be able to comprehensively imagine what it would feel like physically. And then arguably, if you can create that feeling of smelling it and hearing it and touching it, and not yet see it in front of you, does that create a sufficient interference pattern that the entanglement responds and collapses? Because if it does, then I am a quantum mechanic conducting operations upon mechanisms, and then policing becomes all the more important. So hello. I enjoy chess. Otherwise, jiu-jitsu. I don't play anything else with the computer. It's just chess for me. So continue the idea through quantum social sciences. Quantum social sciences necessitate the idea of compatibility of social models with quantum mechanisms, which by virtue of subatomic existence of within social beings technically means that exists, which linguistically gives us a base to explore the idea. The question is, does the linguistic inference have mathematical substantiation, and is that itself an entanglement of the ideas at a biochemical level combined with the brainwaves? If the fluid dynamics and wave propagation of the human brain are sufficiently entangled between feelings until a coherent narrative emerges, then does that mean the subatomic properties of human biology and its physiology, does it necessarily have to be quantum interference at the subatomic level? I stream on Mondays and Wednesdays, approximately 6 to 6:30 p.m. for usually an hour or so. And I started streaming. I did about a dozen episodes a few years ago, and I started again a few weeks ago as part of my study program, as completing my undergraduate degree with plans to go on to the master's degree in doctorate and all that. Speak mind. So quantum superposition necessarily means the mechanisms from which the subatomic particles are in direct contact with. The subatomic realms where how do you recommend I improve the profile? We'll get a logo and that. Okay, I'll have a look at it. Thank you. Is there a link to my YouTube channel? Because I know I definitely did something with the Twitch. If you don't mind that link, clicking on that link, going to the YouTube channel. I have a logo and a banner which I made in MS Paint in about 5 minutes. Would that be sufficient, or do you think something a bit fancier is necessary? Because if I can just use the ones I've got on YouTube for the Twitch, that would be. I see. Okay. So what I need to do is figure out a consistent, coherent narrative which simultaneously means I have to collapse wave functions from the correct sequencing based on arguably a projective geometry, projective psychology, projective topology, because of a quantum topological space, and figure out how I can write reality via my sensorium, and then just rewrite reality as I see fit, to the best of my ability, of course. And then from there, mostly a formality. Cool. I don't have Discord. Just copy and paste it on YouTube if you can. For me, this is much more of a studying thing. So if you're insistent on doing this, I'd much rather you come to me, because once I finished up here today, I'm logging off, doing some life admin, and doing unless I overnight success. This night has millions of subscribers when I wake up tomorrow morning. This is not a priority as much as it is ancillary to my studying system. Thank you very much for the interest. I hope everybody's enjoyed what we've seen today. If you liked it, send us likes, comments, shares, subscriptions, all that jazz.
Have a wonderful evening.
And all that jazz. Yeah.
Cheers. Bye.